Hello, this is Wade Frazier. This is January 31st, 2026, 10:33 p.m. I couldn't sleep. Had a busy day. So this post is going to be about the month of November 1988, which is when Dennis Lee had his preliminary hearing. And this will end this post. I'm going to end it just before I testified, which was the turning point in my life. So the hearing, I believe, began in early November. Could have been late October. I wasn't there for it, so I'm not exactly sure when it began. I was working, so I was working as a temp down in Los Angeles, um, reconciling the garnishment account, readying my bankruptcy filing, these kinds of things. So yeah, yeah, I really wasn't too involved with Dennis's defense at that time. Too busy picking up the pieces of my life. In the previous post, I mentioned my college roommate, but I didn't talk about him in the video, so I'll briefly mention it here. So my college roommate, Robert, my first college roommate, in fact, he's the one who died. Oh my, he died in 2024 of brain cancer, which was probably given to him by the COVID vaccine. Yeah, my other surviving roommate was killed or was crippled by the COVID vaccine. And the other roommate was killed by his cancer treatment. I'm the last man standing among my college roommates. So Robert was one of my investors. And when we started, and the rocket started taking off there in Ventura, heck, we used Robert's company. Robert was the CFO of a videotape company in Hollywood. They made videotapes, and so we used them. And in fact, we became their second biggest customer. And when I was there, it was cash and carry. When I stepped down, apparently my replacement approached Robert and asked if they could have a line of credit. If Robert had asked me about it, because he didn't. If he'd asked me about it, I probably would have cautioned him against giving us credit, as my my own credit card was not getting paid out by the company. So, but he didn't ask me, he did, and when all came crumbling down, his company got sacked with $20,000 of unpaid invoices from our company. And that strained our relationship. And we had our ups and downs, and loved him like a brother. But there was so much carnage. So when an airstrike gets called in on a company like what happened to us, the collateral damage goes far and wide. Lives are wrecked. Lives were shortened. Yeah, it was a catastrophe on many levels. By early November, I had lost most of my naivete by then. So what was that? Almost 3 years with Dennis by that time, and yeah, that was a wild ride, which wasn't finished yet, but that was one wild ride. And so I lost most of my naivete. Human behavior, well, as we'll see here soon, my next post. But after my days with Dennis, human behavior couldn't surprise me again. And the stuff I saw was just, oh God. And in the end, it's kind of like relation to my work. It's what a world of scarcity and fear looks like. And personal integrity is the world's scarcest commodity. And I resisted that all the way, that lesson, until it beaten into my head in no uncertain terms. But personal integrity is also the key for an effort like mine to succeed, or Dennis's, or any effort to really heal the world's ills. It has to be done with people of integrity. But we won't have a prayer it won't have a prayer if the people involved, particularly at the core of it, at the foundation, are not people of integrity. And it's amazed me how people don't understand that. And basically naive people who haven't been through the meat grinder like I have been, or my fellow travelers have been. Yeah, integrity's it. Everything else is a distant second place. Well, in early November, as it turns out, again, it was an eventful month. So George Bush the first beat Mike Dukakis for president. And I mentioned Dukakis earlier, in an earlier post, because when we were in Boston, he was readying his run for the presidency, and he used the Seabrook nuclear power plant for political mileage, getting political capital by challenging it, not approving the evacuation plans and stuff, trying to prevent it from going online. And so yeah, we were there. We were there when Dukakis was using it as a political football. So small world. George Bush the first. In fact, even by that time, I had heard that he was more or less a Rockefeller asset. In fact, Samuel P. Bush, the George Bush the first grandfather, actually worked for the Rockefellers back in the 1800s. And so, yeah, and I've seen this over and over and over again where, oh, these guys work for the Rockefellers. That guy worked for the Rockefellers. Yeah, it's like the Rockefellers. My understanding is that after Jack Kennedy was murdered, David Rockefeller handpicked all American presidents. Yeah, you didn't become president unless David Rockefeller had blessed you. And so this is how the political machine in the United States works. So I don't know who does it today now that David Rockefeller is gone, but yeah, it's it's how to say it doesn't work how it's depicted in the media. That's for sure. Interestingly, though, so about a week after the election, it was announced that the United States also had this big problem with the savings and loan banks. And this was, how to say it, it was another awakening moment for me when that happened, because I worked in 1984, and 85 and 86. I actually worked on the audit of the biggest savings and loan in the world at the time. And it was actually one of the earliest instances of what became the savings and loan scandal. And I believe I've mentioned it previously. I've written about it for many years. That I was only a couple of years into my career, and I was assigned to this audit of the savings and loan because it was the biggest in the world, and it was recording record revenues and record profits, and actually ran out of money, ran out of cash. And then the thing cratered, and there was actually a 1930 style bank run on it. So the federal government had to step in and like emergency loaned them $6 billion just to keep so the deposit run wouldn't put them out of business. Yeah, it was. Anyway, it was something. I was just a junior woodchuck. I was just the errand boy for the guys running the audit. But they treated me great. The two guys, my direct supervisor and the partner who ran the engagement, I was sort of like I was their errand boy, and they treated me great. And about a month after we've been there, about a month, and this is now the autumn of 1984, the partner. To back up a little, so when the government had to step in and keep the doors open, etc., the previous auditor was fired and sued. A huge lawsuit. In fact, it was Arthur Andersen. And in fact, that was the next to last scandal for Arthur Andersen. Enron was the final one that put the final nail in their coffin. And the savings and loan scandal was actually when in 84, there were 8 big firms. Now today, there's only 4. And the savings and loan scandal is part of the reason why. And so, yeah, they all got a big black eye because, as I'm going to get to here, we went out to lunch one day, and the partner, he said, if you looked at what the previous auditors had signed off on, kind of hard to believe they signed off on that. But if we'd been in their shoes, I'm not sure we'd have done any differently. And it was one of these things where I was like, trying to understand what I didn't get it. I didn't understand exactly what he meant. I kind of get what he meant, but what does this mean? And so, and so and what had happened was that this big savings and loan did this. So they're creating a bunch of phony transactions to hide the losses from the carnage that was happening. And the big picture, the oil price shocks of the 1970s, which not only ended the post-war boom, which was the most prosperous period in the human journey so far, but also interest rates spiked to over 20% there by the end of the 70s. And well, the savings loan industry was this industry that was specialized to making home loans. And so all their assets were tied up in loans that paid them 6%. And when the prime interest rate hit 21%, there was something called, I think it was invented about that time, money market accounts were paying 15%. And so who's going to keep their money in a bank getting 3%? But so the savings and loan industry basically lent out at 6%, paid their depositors at 3%. And the 3% difference was what they ran the banks on. That's how the savings and loan industry operated. And it was regulated. They could only, again, it was basically could only loan on homes, these kinds of things. And when the interest rates went through the roof, that's like that, and it was 20%, and then money markets, again, the money markets are paying 15%. And even though it's government insured, 3%, nobody's going to put their money in a bank at 3% when they can get, 15% with a money market. And so there's this big again, it was a death knell for the savings and loan industry because the interest rates, they were just, the 30-year mortgage is paying 6%. They were stuck. They couldn't go to their the people who they loaned to and say, oh, by the way, we now need 15%. It was a fixed rate loan. It wasn't a floating rate loan. So yeah, so the savings loan industry became this dinosaur. And so all the banks started having these tremendous losses. Well, they started losing their deposits, and then Reagan deregulated it. He deregulated the savings loan industry, and so it totally changed the character from this very conservative, industry to this riverboat gambler, high speculative stuff. And actually, the deregulation law, because I've studied this extensively because I saw it on the early days of this. There are actually organized crime rings that were waiting eagerly for the deregulation law to get pushed through. And it was rampant fraud. Again, all the savings and loans were cooking their books to hide the losses. And I won't get into the details here, but they're basically hiding their losses by cooking the books. And the auditors were signing off on these phony financial statements. And this is actually what my partner was really saying. And I was too green. I didn't understand, what he really meant. And it wasn't until that announcement about the week after the election in November of '88 that all of a sudden we had this big problem in the savings loan industry. And all of a sudden it took me back 4 years. And I realized that what we saw at that bank, they were all doing it. So they're all cooking the books. And all the auditors were signing off on these phony financial statements. Well, why would they sign off on phony financial statements? Well, the reason is because they weren't independent. Because the banks could hire them and fire them. And so if you can hire and fire your so-called regulator, then it's really no regulation. In fact, in an endemic problem in government is called regulatory capture. In fact, that's one of the things that Robert Kennedy Jr. is trying to address in the medical field. It's all captured. All the regulators are captured by big pharma in the medical racket. And so this is an endemic problem. Well, how hard is it to capture the regulator whose paycheck you write? And so this is this big conflict event. In fact, my first week before classes began when I went to the university, my dear the chair of the accounting department, who I became his paper grader and tutor eventually, kept in touch with him for years. He actually made this speech that the accounting profession can regulate itself. Ha! I laugh at that today, but I bet he actually thought that. Naive, but I guess I think, yeah, but yeah, you can't free market regulation. You can't. That doesn't work. In fact, this actually ties into Ed Herman and his work on corporations and how they really have corporations are virtually unregulated. And this is an example of it. So yeah, if you can hire your auditors and your auditors aren't going to render independent opinions. And in fact, we've had continuous financial scandals that the auditors could have sounded the alarm, but they didn't because for their audit fees. So they would tend to see things the client's way. So yeah, really weak, almost non-existent regulation, really. I mean, they try to strengthen it because of all these scandals, but it's still the case where you can hire and fire your auditors. Not as easily as it used to be, so it's a little better, but as long as you can't use capitalist means to regulate capitalism. That's one of my college roommates said that. He goes, yeah, you can't free market regulation. It's nonsensical. And my whole profession when I got out of school was this way. So I was in a nonsensical profession that was kind of window dressing for capitalism, acting as if it was regulated, but it really wasn't in the area of financial reporting. So that week after the election, it was like, aha! The light bulb went on, and I go, oh, now I'm kind of seeing it. And I don't know, it took me a while to eventually just for that to sink in, but I remember that was significant when I heard that the problems we had seen was industry wide. And because of that, and again, it was so corrupt. Everything, not only the auditors ran on it, but I said there was actually the CIA was laundering drug money through SNLs, and it was just, yeah. There's government. One of the government studies found that of 64% of the failed savings and loans, it was like half of them failed over the next decade. About 64% of them, they found evidence of fraud. So basically, these savings loans were being looted by people and stuff. Organized crime was involved. Yeah, it was all a big scam. It was all a big. It was make it. It was like a gold rush. Make it while you can. And there were mafia hitmen, this kind of stuff involved. I said the CIA was involved, and actually George Bush the first and Mike Dukakis were both in it up to their eyeballs. So actually, Dukakis himself probably may not have been, but his running mate Lloyd Bentsen was. So Lloyd Bentsen was from Texas, and Texas and California and Colorado. These are like the biggest states for the scandal. All the phony, fraudulent real estate transactions, etc. Those are the big states for it. And then George Bush the first, Texas guy. Well, his son Neil. He was actually the figurehead for a $1 billion meltdown in a bank in Colorado, he was kind of the poster boy for the scandal with Neil Bush. And so I believe, in fact, dollars to donuts, that the two campaigns decided that neither one of them would bring up this issue until after the election. Because it wouldn't serve either one, and neither one of them would look good if this came out. So they literally waited until a week after the election to finally announce, hey, we got a problem. And if my auditing profession had been, without these conflicts of interest, and could have actually rendered independent opinions way back in early 80s, 81 or something, before the deregulation, they would have been sounding the alarm that the savings loan industry is in trouble. And if they had done that, the problem could have been solved for probably, $10 billion, some pretty small number. In fact, by 86, the estimates are 20 billion would have sunsetted it, solved it, it would have taken care of it. But the deregulation mania of Republicans, and Reagan in particular, it turned a $10 billion problem into a $150 billion disaster. And the taxpayer had to pay the American taxpayer paid like $130 billion for the disaster, which is all on Reagan's watch. And this was something that, and I studied this quite a bit. In my radicalized days of study, I studied this quite a bit, and it became so obvious to me, how things work. And then again, years and years later, I'm reading, Ed Herman, and write about, how the media operates, and again, the conflicts of interest, et cetera. And so, so there's this huge conflict of interest that rendered my profession irrelevant. And they were supposed to sound the alarm like a cop. They're financial cops, but they were cops on the tape. So so they were not looking after. And again, ultimately, the taxpayer ended up holding the bag for all that. And the money didn't just disappear; it went into people's pockets. So there was this huge looting of basically the American taxpayer by Reagan's friends, Bush's friends, this kind of thing. So so it's interesting that all happened that month. My pivotal month of my life, that was like mid-month that came out. And a couple weeks later, I ended up testifying. And before I get to that, though, I wanted, now I'm going to get into the preliminary hearing. And trials. So in the American legal system, trials begin with prosecution starts off with their witnesses and evidence, et cetera. And then comes the defense. And so in theory, that favors the defendants. And it should, right? So presumed innocent until guilty. And so if the defendant's defense gets the last words, that may be the most, how to say it, it may be the most present in the minds of the jurors. I think that's the concept behind that. So the prosecution went first. And I earlier wrote about how the sheriff's department spent months calling up several hundred customers. We called several hundred customers trying to manufacture victims and trying to fish around for people who are unsatisfied, et cetera. And after 9 months, they finally came up with 9 people who they said were the 9 victims that supported the fraud charges, was what supported the $1 million bail they arrested Dennis with. And I've written about these 9 victims at length, so I'm not going to belabor it. Again, my Substack post links to it for people who are interested. But of the 9 so-called victims, only one acted like one. And he was memorable because several months before Dennis was arrested, I actually cut the check to this guy to refund his kit, refund his money. So Dennis's cure tour. So this is the guy who said, "Hey, I want my money back." So he got his money back. And that's anyway. So, ta-da! He got his money back. What do you have to complain about? In fact, this guy, I think, if anybody was a plant from the sheriff's department, it was him. And when he got on the witness stand, he actually made the case that we should have paid him for the time he spent reading and watching our materials. So this is his complaint, that he actually wasted time reading our materials. That was his complaint. Didn't lose any money, but he lost some time reading our materials, watching our tapes. Another one of the so-called victims actually stole our materials from us. He stole from us. So he was a thief. He stole our kit from us, and somehow he becomes a victim. Yeah, this is, and then another one of the so-called victims, I mentioned this previously, was a man who actually lived in the San Fernando Valley, Los Angeles. So he lived down there in Los Angeles, outside of Ventura County. So it was outside of the jurisdiction of Ventura County. But not many of the kit buyers really lived near us. So this was a national thing. So there weren't too many local so-called victims that they could try to manufacture. But this guy, in fact, Mr. Deputy showed up to the guy's house. And started asking him very leading questions, et cetera. Again, it was so transparent what he was trying to do. And it really irritated this man. In fact, because he was in LA County, not Ventura County, he actually told Mr. Deputy to get off his premises. He was no longer welcome at this guy's home. Yeah, he considered Mr. Deputy to be just scum. You know, this lying sack, lying sack sheriff's deputy. That's how he regarded him as. And so he's on the witness stand as a victim. And he was confused. And he goes, "Why am I here?" You know, because Dennis is a saint, and the Mr. Deputy, he's scum. so anyway, so they dismissed him. And they didn't ask him back as a so-called victim. And to me, you know, again, Mr. Deputy a few months earlier had won an award for completing the most difficult investigation in department history. And he was a fair-haired boy, promoted to be in charge of the jail, to lieutenant, all this kind of stuff. And that so-called victim exemplifies the incompetence of those people. Yeah, how in the world could this man be a victim, particularly a fraud, when he loved Dennis and despised Mr. Deputy? This is the logic that we were dealing with. But it was a kangaroo court, which we'll get to. And there are also expert witnesses. So I earlier discussed our stop at Amway's headquarters to test our system. In fact, there was again, in the big truck that I drove across the continent, we put it in there, and it was what's called a rack mount. It was another panel array. And so the panels were stacked with like slices of a loaf of bread. And, you know, the COPs aren't as high. In fact, one of the guys who worked for us in Ventura from New England, he bought a rack mount, had it on his home, and he said it saved half of his energy costs. So not quite 2/3, and that's probably because the rack didn't have as much environmental contact as a flat array on the southern exposure. Be my guess. Although I think this was partly installed by I don't know if it was, maybe it wasn't. And in fact, it may have been. So the salesman who got his family involved, the one I lived with for a month, and Dennis and Allison lived with, who bought Dennis's remaining inventory in Seattle. That rack mount, he actually didn't know what he was doing, and he did what's called liquid charging the unit. So the refrigerant is supposed to be, you're supposed to just have the can there, and the vapor is supposed to evaporate into the system. You don't, but he was actually pouring liquid refrigerant into the system, and that damages the compressor, the pump. So it damaged it. So he broke the pump. And so when they tested it at Amway, an alternative energy college tested it, it didn't work that well. It got a COP of like 3 or 4, when it probably should have got, I remember it was a 90-degree day in the sunshine. It should have got an 8 or 9, and it got like a 3 or 4. And so Amway declined further involvement. In fact, when we got to Ventura, in fact, Stan, the engineer, he saw that too. That this guy was sales guy was liquid charging the system was broken. So we actually fixed it. We actually had to replaced it. We replaced the compressor there in Ventura. But that guy, so the prosecution had an endless well of money to bring in witnesses from all over the United States. And so this professor from this college, in fact, when they raided us, they saw the correspondence. And so, yeah, they used all the correspondence to find victims and witnesses and experts, this kind of stuff. And so this guy testified. So his involvement with Dennis's system was testing a broken system once. But he's some kind of expert now. And there was another expert witness who was a college professor, some kind of professor, and he had actually never seen Dennis's system before. He'd never seen it operate before, but he testified that the high COPs were impossible. Yeah, he'd never actually seen one of Dennis's systems. There were thousands in the field, but so again, these are the kind of experts that testify at the preliminary hearing. And I mentioned Blake, the head installer in Seattle, and Brian, who was the engineer, one of the engineers who was involved with the heat. Again, how to say it? Blake was competent, Brian wasn't. So Blake was a competent installer. Brian was not a competent engineer related to this technology. And both of them tried to extort money from us the previous year, which I described. And so, anyways, they testified. And I don't know what Blake testified to, but Dennis said Blake seemed pretty gleeful in his testimony. He was happy to see Dennis in leg irons, with $1 million bail, etc. So he did. Blake sank his dagger in as far as he could. Uh, Brian was this engineer who, and I won't get too far in the background here, but when Dennis, had his company stolen on the East Coast, eventually ended up in Seattle, where there was this bank making the heat pump with the original patent. Brian was their engineer, but he was a young kid. He was like about my age, and he didn't know what he was doing. And he couldn't think past his textbooks. And I've mentioned this before in my work, where that heat pump, Dennis's heat pump, when compared to an air-to-air heat pump, it produced twice the pressures. The exhaust temperature was 100 degrees Fahrenheit higher than air-to-airs. It was more than twice as efficient as measured in a coefficient of performance. So the air-to-airs would get about a COP of 2, Dennis's would get 6. So it's 3 times as much. So it's pretty typical. And the refrigeration textbooks, though, would say that refrigeration systems could only produce about 12,000 BTUs per horsepower of compressor. And Dennis had 4 horsepower compressors for his system. And so, anyway, 4 times 12 was 48,000 BTUs an hour, according to the textbook, except Dennis's produced 100,000 BTUs an hour. And in fact, Brian ran tests at the facilities showing 100,000 BTUs an hour. And during the hearing, and Dennis knew that Brian was an idiot, okay? And so Brian gets up there and he's holding forth on whatever he's holding forth on, and Dennis said, "Okay, how many BTUs per horsepower can Dennis's system get?" And Brian goes, "Oh, well, 12,000 is the most you can get." And then Dennis introduced into evidence. In fact, this was the only test data that was introduced into evidence in preliminary hearing, to my knowledge, because the way it works is that the person who performed the test has to testify and then read and introduce the documentation. So there's this mountain of scientific data. And if you chased off all the people who did the testing, then it wouldn't be admissible to court. And this is how kangaroo court operates. And so Brian was there, the guy who would try to extort us the previous year. He's there to try to bury Dennis. And then when he said, "Oh, yeah, it's 12,000 because my textbook says so," and then introducing the evidence was his own test showing 25,000 BTUs per horsepower, twice as much as the textbooks. And so, anyway, so inadvertently, the prosecution allowed evidence to get on the record, which should have. The scientific evidence got on the record from the stupid engineer who was trying to bury Dennis, who couldn't think past his textbooks, even when his own eyes, his own tests showed it did twice what the textbooks would say. So, an ironic, kind of funny moment. Yeah, so Mr. Deputy and friends threatened and chased off everybody who could testify to the heat pump's performance. And again, there's a mountain, and in fact, in the post I linked to it. I've linked to it a bunch. I published several tests. Several scientific tests have been done. Performance tests have been done on Dennis's heat pump. And again, COPs 6, 7, this kind of thing. 5 in Minneapolis in the wintertime, this kind of stuff. And so, yeah. And what came out later, which I'll get into later, which was there was actually a test lab in Arizona, which it got us it tested a COPS7. And again, it's an interesting story. And it came out. In fact, it wasn't in the discovery evidence. So again, these criminals, the Mr. Deputy and stuff, these guys were gangsters, and they did not have it in, they did not put it in the discovery evidence because they didn't want it to come out that they had actually lied to and intimidated this lab in Arizona to terrify them. Actually, they lied to them and said that the system that Dennis was promoting and stuff, it was not the one they tested, but it was. And so they just lied and they tag teamed him. Every day they were calling him saying, "Oh yeah, blah 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 blah," and they were terrifying them about they were being wrapped up in some big fraud scam or something. And we found this out. We didn't find this out till later. And so, but that was, yeah. So this is what they were doing, and we'll never how deep the evil went. We'll never know. I will never know how deep all that evil went. I said the global elites were involved, and yeah, it was so dirty, so ugly, and we'll never know how deep it went. But but some things would come to light like that, and it was accidental. And so, and I'll get to that in a future post. It was poetic how that happened. And sometime before the preliminary hearing, and again, Mr. Deputy, he got promoted to be in charge of the jail, even though he really didn't run the jail because it was just another, it was just a plum given. It was an attaboy given to him, and again, and also to look over the comfort of his career catching Dennis. And so, yeah, so he wasn't around the jail much. He was off golfing. And he was living large in those days. But one day, Dennis was I don't know getting a meal or something. He encountered Mr. Deputy. Mr. Deputy, I don't know if he approached it. He approached Dennis, and he had this kind of glittery eye and kind of smile, and it's like, "Hey, Dennis, how do you like it in jail?" Yeah, that's what a saint this guy was. Well, anyway, Dennis said, "You will answer to God for this." And Mr. Deputy reported this as Dennis's threatened my life. Yeah, he said Dennis threatened my life when Dennis said, "You're going to be accountable to God," and he interpreted that, and he actually it ended up in court that Dennis, I think he filed something. Dennis threatened his life by saying that God, he would be accountable to God in the end. And that's Dennis as a Christian. And yes, nobody gets away with anything. So I said I wouldn't want Mr. Deputy's afterlife. I can barely imagine all the lives he ruined as a gangster sheriff's deputy. Yeah, the tally must be awesome. Yeah, he was there for 30 years or something. So yeah, it must have been an awesome tally of criminality on his part. Um, and I also noted previously that Victor Fisher disappeared after Dennis was arrested. Stan disappeared after his Stan the engineer after his misadventure with Ken Hodgel over there in Texas when they fired him, so they got those stickers away from him. And Mr. Researcher lived locally, but he was terrified. Again, he saw them raid his. Again, he was terrified. McDowell, the Mr. Deputy threatened him, all this kind of stuff. And so, yeah, in fact, uh, Dennis's attorney was trying to serve a subpoena on him to testify. And anyway, he hid in his home, and they actually camped a subpoena server right outside his house. And one morning, at like 3 a.m. or something, he left home and went into hiding, and he was in hiding for months. And in fact, his wife called me after he went into hiding, saying she didn't know where he went. So yeah, he went into hiding for months, and there'll be more on that later. So with all of that, everybody, I was the only member of the inner circle other than Dennis's wife, I think, who couldn't testify. I don't think she was allowed to because she was his wife. So I became the star witness. So I became the star witness because everybody else disappeared. And so my testimony is what's going to come next. And it was a turning point in my life. So, anyway, that's all for now.